Okay, so talking about the second important framework that we are going to cover into the important frameworks in Zeek, Intel framework. Intel framework is another framework that is pretty important, and you can get value right out of the box if you have enabled it and if you have files that you can load in Zeek and tell Zeek that what to look for in the traffic and what you would like to see into the intel.log file. So as it mentions that it automatically watches the traffic for malicious indicators, and you need to have the indicators file, of course, first of all, as input for Zeek to watch for. So if you tell Zeek basically that these are the IOCs that I'm interested in, and you need to tell me that if you see those IOCs in my network, just alert us into the intel.log file and just log that activity into the intel.log file. So now the second question is that what it can actually watch for. So there are a lot of different types of indicators available in the internet, right? That you have bad IPs. Spamhaus provides the list of malicious IPs, and there is Fishtank that provides the list of the domains, the bad domains and whatnot, or the phishing domains and whatnot. So there are different types of intel. So what Zeek is capable of looking into the traffic, right? Zeek has to support that intel type for watching the traffic for, right? So the list that is shown on the slide are the different type of intel that Zeek supports, and the three ones that I have highlighted are the important ones that are used very common. Which is ADDR, which is the address, that means the IP address. So if you have list of malicious or bad IP addresses that you want to watch for in your traffic, that's Zeek capable of looking into or capable of supporting it. The second one is the domain, which is the DNS. So if you have list of bad domains or malicious domains that you want to look for, then you can absolutely have a list of bad domains. And the third important one is this file hash. So a lot of times when people find or when people get breached or when they have different indicators that they would like to share with the real world in internet, they have file hashes. So if there is a ransomware, right, and if somebody got a hold of the executable of ransomware, it can create a hash and it can circulate that hash in the industry or in the community saying that, hey, this is a bad hash and this hash belongs to a ransomware. So keep an eye for that hash in your traffic if you are seeing any executables traversing on your network. So Zeek is also capable of monitoring for the hashes. And in a couple of sections before, when I was discussing the files framework and we were discussing the files.log, it was one of the fields was the analyzers, and that analyzer we saw that there were three analyzers that were attached to a connection, which was MD5, SHA-1, and extract. So those analyzers are responsible of generating the hash for a file that is transpiring on the network, and they are responsible for extracting it if you have the extraction analyzer enabled. So anyways, so these are some of the types of intel that Zeek can watch for or that Zeek can monitor, and the three important ones are the address, domain, and file hashes. Also, it can look for URLs. So if you have bad URLs, you can give the URLs and it can look for the URLs, bad software, spamming email addresses that you want to take that you want Zeek Intel to monitor for, and the username, file name, and cert hash as well. So these are all the other types of Intel type that Zeek supports. Where does it look? So now another question is that, okay, we have this input file that has like a couple of thousands of indicators that are bad. Some of them are IPs, some of them are hashes, some of them are domains, and we feed that into Zeek. Now, the question is that where exactly Zeek is looking for those indicators. If it is parsing each and every packet with that indicator, then it is just going to be too exhaustive for Zeek, right? Because it cannot just look for a random hash in all the packets to find a match. But Zeek is smart. What Zeek actually looks for is it knows that a hash is going to it knows that it is going to find the hash in the file hash framework, like files analyzer. So if there is an analyzer if there is file analyzers attached to a connection, then that means there is a files file transfer happening on that connection, and it has to only look for the hashes in the file analyzer, not all of the other artifacts of that connection. So it is pretty smart in detecting where exactly it is trying to look for that Intel type. So some of the fields that fields that it looks for, that it looks at for finding that IOC are these events. So in connection, in originating, originator, in responding, files hash. So these in file hash, in name, in DNS. Actually, it looks for the bad domains in the DNS request and response. For bad links, it checks it in the SMTP messages. For server name, it checks it in SSL, and then for the cert and URL, it checks in the HTTP and X509 analyzers. So this is pretty neat that Zeek looks for specific intel in a specific type of analyzer, and it does not do an exhaustive regex matching in all kind of analyzers that are attached to a connection. Intel framework detecting IOCs. So what you need to do to enable Intel framework in Zeek. So all you need to do is you have to enable the BIF framework, which is the Intel Scene and Intel Do Notice. So these are the two scripts that comes with the frameworks files that Zeek ships with. They are not loaded by default. You have to load them in your local.zeek. So if you load only Intel.scene, Intel/scene, you are only going to get the event logged into the intel.log file corresponding to a hit for an IOC that you have loaded. But if you load do notice as well, then there will be two entries for a particular hit. One will be in the intel.log file, and then the second one will be in the notice.log file. So if you are just monitoring notice log file and you don't care about intel, then you can just do notice and be done with it. But if you want it not to be logged in notice, but to be logged in Intel, then you can go with the first one. But you can have both enabled as well, and it is just going to create a duplicate record in notice.log apart in addition to the intel.log file. All right, and so this takes care, so the first two lines at the rate load takes care of loading the scripts that are responsible for generating the Intel alerts. The second most important thing is you need to feed Zeek the IOCs that you have in your file, right? So there is this redefinable enum type, which is called Intel : read files. All you need to do is you have to just add the path of the Intel file that you want Zeek to load, or you want Zeek to watch for. And that file, the ioc.intel, will have all the IOCs that you want Zeek to take a look at, or that you want Zeek to watch for your traffic. So these are the only two configuration changes you require to enable Intel framework in your network. Okay, so I think this is the part of exercise. So we will try to load Intel framework in our current install in our VM, and we will try to load a dummy Intel file, which will have some of the IOCs. They are not IOCs, they are dummy IOCs, and we are trying to get a hit and produce an intel.log file for the IOCs that we have mentioned in the bro-ioc.intel. So let's jump ahead and try to do that. So the bro-ioc.intel, the IOCs file is in the B-side folder, and we are just going to copy that into our local Zeek path and copy it into the local Zeek path. Okay, so let's go into the local Zeek path and see what that file looks like. Let's take a look into the bro IOC. I only have one entry that says that there is this IP address. Okay, so another thing to note. So the file format for the IOCs that you need to load in Zeek follows the tab separated format, and it needs to have the files with these headers. You cannot change them. So if you have a list of IPs, you need to make sure that you transfer those IP into the DAT file or the bro IOC file that bro is able to read from. So this is the format that the bad IP goes here, and then the first column is the indicator. It can be IP address, it can be domain, or any of the types that is supported by Zeek. The second column is the indicator type. You need to tell Zeek that what is the type of the indicator, so that it can look for that type in that corresponding space. Remember, we were talking about Zeek does not do an exhaustive regex match. It is smart enough to see that, oh, it's an address. So I should look into the originating IP or originating response IP. So this indicator type helps Zeek to narrow down its search. So you need to define the type that, and it has its own format. So you need to define the type saying Intel : ADDR, which tells Zeek that it's an IP address. The third field is these are the metadata fields that are optional. And if you have CIF enabled, CIF framework enabled, then you need those optional fields. But they are optional. You can have them, you can remove them. It's up to you. But these two fields are important. So it says that the description, why this is a bad IP, or why any description that will help you figure out if you have that hit in your intel.log, that description will get also logged with that hit. So it will help you, a description will give a little bit of more background of why that IP was triggered. The confidence percentage, so this is the CIF confidence rate, which is, it is saying that CIF is confident at 85%. CIF is confident 85% that this IP is bad. And then the source, I got that from the openiocs.net. So that's the format of the IOC file that you want to load in Zeek. And make sure it's tab separated. So we are just going to do a quick check to see if it's tab separated, because if it's not tab separated, then Zeek will not be able to read it. So I'm just making sure that it's tab separated and there are no extraneous spaces. I'm just removing the spaces and changing the spaces, replacing the spaces with the tab. That's all I'm doing right now. Okay, so my entry is now tab separated. So I'm going to write it off and exit. Okay, so now we have a Intel Zeek formatted Intel file. It can be anything. It can be .dat or .txt. The suffix doesn't have to be .intel. It can be broioc.dat or broioc.txt, up to you. So this is not mandatory to be .intel. So don't get confused. So now I have the file of IOC that is formatted in the way that Zeek is supposed to read from. Now all I need to do is I need to load that IOC in Zeek, and I need to enable the Intel framework and then start Zeek. So for that, I'm going to go into the, and I'm going to load the Intel framework in my local. Copy and paste. So what this line is doing is it is saying Zeek that I want to load the Intel framework, and I have an Intel file for you to watch the traffic for. And that file is this. Okay, let's try that. So what we have done right now is I have local.zeek is the site policy that I use for my Zeek customization. And all I have done is I have told Zeek that I want to load the Intel framework, and this is my Intel file. This is my IOC file that you should read from. That's all we did. And we have to make sure that this IOC file is actually in the opt/Zeek, which is, I think, in the opt/Zeek. So here, it is here, opt/Zeek. It is in the opt. It is in the opt/Zeek. So this is our file, and we have loaded it in the Zeek. So let's see if we run it from, if we run it against a PCAP, and if it runs. I'm just going to go to the logs and run it from here. Okay, all I'm doing is I'm reading a PCAP, which is http.pcap, which is in my repository called bsites, that we have cloned, and I'm reading it and I'm loading the policies in the local.zeek as well. I need to correct that. So it should not be PCAP, it should be cap. I will change that in the slides. So, but if you're following the tutorial, I have ran it against the PCAP, and it says that there is no such file, and I have run it against the .cap, and it has run just fine. And we see there is a file called intel.log now. We were not seeing this file before. So let's see what's in that file. Okay, so it is saying that there's a hit for this IP address. There's an IP, a client IP that is going to that IP address, which is a web server. And Zeek is saying that this is an IOC I have seen, and it is an Intel address IOC, and this is the source, or this is this is the source, and it has seen it in the connection in response. And Intel address ADDR is the type of Intel it has seen. So we have seen now that if you have a list of IP addresses that are IOCs that are bad, how can you load it in Zeek, and how you can tell Zeek to watch that IOCs in the traffic. So this PCAP has that bad IP address, and that bad IP address belongs to the server, belongs to a web server. And all Zeek is doing right now is it is creating an intel.log file saying that there was a hit from one of the IOCs that you have loaded, and there is a hit, and I have loaded and I have looked it into, I have logged it into the intel.log file. So that's what the intel.log file is saying right now, that this is the event, that this is the log that got generated. And all this metadata is coming from our, all this metadata is coming from our Intel IOC that, or Intel IOC Intel IOC file that we have loaded in Zeek. Okay, so that worked. So this is a kind of like a background. This example just shows that how you can make Zeek watch for IP addresses, but you can absolutely try DNS as well. Or if you have hashes or URLs, you can absolutely try those as well. Let me see what else is there in that http.cap. It has only one connection. Okay, yeah, it has only one connection here. And it's called www.ethereal.com. So let's try to get the hit on the domain instead of IP. So if you do not have the IP and you have a domain instead, you say you are having a file that says that www.ethereal.com is a bad domain. You want a hit on the domain now, not on IP. So how we can do that? So let's try doing that. So let's remove all the logs from here right now, so that we don't have anything here. Where is our, so this is our local file. So now I want to add a domain. So what was the domain? www.ethereal.com. This is the domain that is bad. The indicator type is domain, not ADDR, and just have something dummy as metadata description, CIF 90%, and then source manual. Let's say that and save it. Okay, so what we have done is we have just added another entry in our IOCs file, and this time this entry is a domain entry. We are saying to Zeek that this domain is the bad domain with the 90% confidence, and this is the source and this is the description. So that's all we are doing right now, and see if we can get a hit on the domain. So let's go back to the logs and run that command again. Okay, so now we have another hit. It says Intel domain. So it says Intel, the first one is the Intel address because we haven't deleted the, we haven't removed the address IOC, but we have added a domain IOC. So this is the second hit in the intel.log file saying that, hey, I have seen this domain, which is listed as bad domain in your Intel IOC file. And it's a type, it's an Intel domain type. This is the description that we put, which was manual. And where it has seen it in the HTTP header host. It's not a DNS request, but it is in the HTTP header. And this is where we were assuming it would look for, right? Because we intentionally picked this domain because we saw that in the http.log file here. So this is the header domain, and this is the host that it was connecting to. So I intentionally picked that so that we can get a hit, and I can show you that if you have bad domains, you can load them into Zeek, and whenever Zeek sees those domains in either HTTP connections or DNS connections or wherever it looks for or wherever it checks for the domain Intel type, it is going to produce an alert, or it is going to produce a log in intel.log file corresponding to that IOC. So these are two different kinds of Intel hits that we have seen, and how you can format the file. Make sure that you format the Intel IOC file in the way that Zeek wants you to. It should be tab separated, and don't forget the field header. It looks for a very specific field header, and it should be that and similar to that. And these are the two manual entries that we created, one for IP address and one for DNS name that you want to look for. Okay, so that's a wrap for IOCs and Intel framework. And to recap, for Intel framework, all you need to do is have the IOC file. And if you have that IOC file, you need to tell Zeek to load it, right? So you need to load it in your shared local, in your site local file. So this is all we did. Only 2 steps. We loaded the Intel framework, we loaded the IOC file, and then we put the IOC file in that path for Zeek to pick up. So these are the only 2 changes we have done, and we have now started getting hits from our Intel framework. That's pretty nice, because these 2 simple steps will enable you to watch for bad actors and malicious actors in your traffic. And real story, we usually get the paid feeds, paid malicious feeds, like the paid bad IPs and domains feed, and they are pretty nice. Like if people are reporting attacks from bad IPs or bad domains, and if you get this list and you proactively start blocking them as soon as you see them in your traffic, then you kind of like avoid that kind of attack on your network. So again, the intel.log file, we take heavy actions on intel.log file. Whenever we see an IOC hit in intel.log file, especially IPs, whenever we see bad IPs getting hit in intel.log file, and if the confidence percentage is above 85%, we absolutely log that IP, and we black hole route that IP on our border routers. It's just like you need to get a good feed, and even if you don't have the paid feed, there are a lot of open source free sites that provide feeds. For example, Spam House is the one, Phishing Tank, Fish Tank is another one that has bad domains reported by people that are fish domains. So those are really good sources to start with for collecting the IOC feed for your network. And once you have that good IOC feed, you can absolutely enable Intel framework and tell Zeek to automatically detect those IOCs in your network and produce intel.log file. So that's pretty neat functionality, actually, that you don't have to manually look for or check for IOCs. Other thing I wanted to point out, that every time people share the IOCs for a new attack, if you're subscribed to those email lists, and if you happen to get that from your colleague saying, hey, this is the bad hash from the new ransomware attack, the new ransomware executable, the first thing I do is personally, I load that IOC in Intel framework, in Intel format, and then I just let Zeek produce intel.log file if it is seeing that IOC. And we just alert on whatever, if we see and hit on that specific IOC that we have loaded in Zeek. So that is pretty handy. And once you have set it up, all you need to do is you need to just edit your IOC file for adding new IOC types, and that's it. And Zeek will automatically detect the new added IOCs as well. That's the beauty. You don't have to restart Zeek every time the IOC file changes. If you add new IPs, Zeek will automatically pick up the new additions in the file. You don't have to restart Zeek for loading new Intel in Zeek. That reminds me that the new additions will get auto detected. But if you remove the IPs, or if you remove any IOCs from your Intel file that you are loading in Zeek, it does not get automatically removed from the data stores of Zeek workers. There is a flag that there is a flag that usually is turned off. You need to turn it on for detecting the removal of the IOCs, and for removing them from the data stores of the workers. That you saw that you don't need different files for different types of indicators. I have added an IP and I have added a domain in the same file. So you don't have to worry about, oh, I have 3 files of bad IPs and 1 file of domain, so let me create 4 files or 4 types of IOC files in Zeek format that Zeek can load from. You can absolutely have just one big dump file, which is not recommended, but you can absolutely have a mixed IOCs in one file. I hope you get the idea behind it, that you can have multiple indicator types in one file and Zeek will not have any trouble in reading it. So that's another point that I wanted to note regarding Intel framework.